Today on Trucks, Stacey and I take you step by step through the installation of an air suspension kit on a Ford F-150. After that, we'll turn up the heat and show you some basic tips that'll help you lay down a perfect weld. Then we'll pull up a seat and rebuild a classic carburetor, the Stromberg 97. That's all today on Trucks. Hello everybody, and thanks for joining us this week. If you've been hanging around the truck shop for any time at all, you've seen us lower an S10 in the past few weeks using spindle, springs, and blocks. Today we're going to lower this full-size F-150 with an air spring system that's going to allow us to raise it back up depending on our mood or driving conditions with the flick of a switch.
But wait a minute, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at some of the ingredients that make this truck stand out just as it sits. Has a nice tube grill treatment, full ground effects. Of course, you can't miss those Colorado custom wheels. But for me, it's those subtle ghost flames that roll up over the hood, lick down the side, and flicker out over the tail.
While Stace gets our Ford up in the air so we can get the wheels off it, I'll go ahead and show you the kit we're going to be using on the rear. It's from Air Ride Technologies and comes with a powder-coated 4-bar setup that replaces your stock leaf springs. It also comes with Firestone's air springs, a panner bar and bracket, high-strength lines, as well as a compressor to put it all in motion.
Now, some of the benefits of an air ride system is that it gives you the smooth ride of a luxury car, but the increased payload and towing capacity of a big truck. Heck, about the only thing this won't do is make your truck jump. If you want to do that, you got to go with hydraulics.
Yeah, and a lot more money. First thing we need to do is get a jack under the rear end. Now, I know we've told you this before, but if you don't want to wrestle the rear end, get some support under it before you pull the U-bolts out.
Now, 90% of the time when you go to pull a bolt out of a leaf spring, it's rusted in place. So I like to hit them with a little bit of lubricant to help knock them free. Now, we're going to replace this whole shackle, but we're going to reuse this bolt because it holds the exhaust hanger.
Now comes the toughest part of this project, and that's grinding off the rivet heads from the stock spring bracket. Make sure you put up some sort of shroud to deflect the sparks away from the gas tank. The reason you need to grind off the stock heads is because the kit replaces the entire OE bracket and bolts right to the frame rail using the existing holes.
Hey Mel, you want to give me a hand?
You bet.
Now we can start bolting on the new hardware, starting with these brackets. The bottom bracket slides under the brake lines and up into the spring perch. The top bracket has a centering pin that drops into the top of the spring perch. Now go ahead and put your bolts in and tighten them down.
As you can see, there's a place right here on the front bracket to connect your emergency brake cables. Once that's taken care of, we can bolt on the upper and lower bars. Now, one of the cool things about this system from Air Ride Technologies is the polyurethane bushing that's designed to absorb road vibration. On the other end, you have an adjustable heim joint that eliminates suspension bind. The two ends are connected by thick-walled steel for extra strength.
Now we can mount the upper bracket for our air spring. Now it goes directly above the lower bracket, and I've already drilled the holes for it. Now before you bolt it on, take the pannered bar bracket, slide it inside the frame rail, then take your upper spring bracket and bolt it into place, kind of making a frame sandwich. Now we can put on the air spring. And make sure that you use Teflon tape on this fitting or it'll leak like crazy. The air spring is held on with just 3 bolts, 2 on the top, 1 on the bottom. The biggest question that people ask is how much height adjustment am I going to get? Well, with this system, you'll get anywhere from 5 to 6 inches in the rear, and that's considerable.
Once you're done with one side, move over to the other and repeat the same process. Just a reminder, it's always a good idea to do one side at a time so you don't have to chase the rear end all over your driveway. We're almost done with the rear end. I mounted the bracket for the panner bar and it bolts right to the pumpkin. Now the purpose of the panner bar is to keep the rear end from moving side to side. Replace the stock shocks and the rear end's done.
Now that we have our 4-bar and air springs in place, we can get ready to run our lines and mount the compressor that comes with the kit. Now an air suspension has a high air volume, so running a compressor alone, that's not going to get it. That's why Air Ride Technologies supplies an air tank, so you'll always have enough air to run the system. Mel, you ready for this?
Yeah, thanks, Stace. First thing we need to do is find a place to mount the compressor along with the air tank. On this floor, we got plenty of room to go right here on the outer frame rail. Keep in mind, it's always a good idea to put the compressor on the frame rail as opposed to the firewall or a body panel to help eliminate vibration noises in the cab.
Are you about done with that compressor?
Yeah, I think we're set.
I'm going to go ahead and mount this air tank. Now, fortunately, we've got a lot of room on the frame rail here close to the compressor, so that's where she'll go.
Now we can run our lines from the tank to the rear springs. This system operates on high pressure, so the lines that come with the kit are thick-walled and connect to brass fittings to prevent any leakage. It's also very important to use rubber grommets anytime you run air lines through metal. Now that we have the rear end of our air ride system complete, it's time to take a break, but don't go away. We'll hook up the front and slam our F-150 when Trucks returns. Later on Trucks, we'll turn up the heat and show you how to handle a welder. But up first, we're going to finish putting the airbags on our F-150 so we can slam it to the ground.
Welcome back. Now, if you're just joining us, we're right in the middle of putting an air suspension on our F-150. For you lowrider guys, there's nothing wrong with a hydraulic system. They just cost a lot more and take a whole lot more fabrication than the bolt-on kit from Air Ride Technologies.
And while it's true this system won't hop like hydraulics will, it does give you up to 6 inches of adjustment without sacrificing ride quality. The front end kit comes with a dual needle air pressure gauge for front and rear control, shocks, and airbags with custom brackets that bolt right up to your vehicle.
Now, one of the biggest questions that people ask about airbags is, how safe are they? Am I going to pop one? Well, as you can see by this cutaway, they're made of 4 layers of nylon cord and rubber, much like a car tire. And heck, semi-trucks have been using these things for 40 years.
Hey, if it's good enough for a semi, then it's got to be good enough for us. What we have on our Ford here is an upper and lower A-arm independent front suspension. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the tie rod in. Next, you'll need to undo the sway bar and remove the stock shock.
Now, you can remove your brake caliper and spindle and all this junk if you want to, but you don't have to. We're going to pop it loose right here at this upper ball joint and rotate the whole assembly down. Now, if you do it like this, make sure that you undo your ABS line from your upper A-arm so you have some slack when you roll it down. Then you can loosen your ball joint nut, but do not take it all the way off. Hit the upper spindle and the spring will force the ball joint apart.
Most of the time the spring will fall right out, but if you start to lower the jack and there's still tension on the spring, make sure to use a spring compressor. You can rent one at any parts store.
Now, you may have noticed we're using a different style of spring on the front than we used on the rear. This is a double convoluted design that flexes up to 30 degrees to compensate for the extra movement that you get in an independent front suspension.
Thanks to the custom bracket from Air Ride Technologies, installation's real easy. It's also a lot easier to hook up your air lines before you get the spring in place. It goes right where the coil spring was and bolts through the upper shock hole. Now you can jack up the A-arm so you can reassemble the sway bar and tie rod end.
The last thing we need to do is put on the front shocks. Now, like the rear, we're going to use a good gas shock with plenty of travel to keep things from binding up when we slam this truck down. We're going to mount our top bracket to the upper A-arm support, and the bottom goes right to the lower A-arm itself.
Tell you what, Stace, that's definitely a big rig setup on our light truck, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to believe nobody came up with this sooner.
Yeah, it really is. Let's go ahead and get that gauge and the lines hooked up and see what this system will do.
All right. When you're prepping your air lines, there's a couple things I'd like to point out. First of all, when you cut them, it's best to use a flat surface and a razor blade to get a nice straight cut. And these fittings are really cool. Just slide the line in and it locks with an airtight seal. But pull this little collar back and it'll pop right out again.
Mounting the interior gauge is limited only by your imagination. The standard mount is under the dash using the supplied bracket. We wanted to get more creative than that though, not to mention gauges under the dash always seem to get in the way. So we decided to mount ours right here. Go ahead and push the rest of those lines up, Stace. Once the air is connected, splice into a wire from your instrument panel to illuminate the bulb in the gauge when your lights are on.
While Mel's taking care of things up in the cab, I've raised the truck back up and run the lines from the front back to the air tank. Now make sure you use some wire ties on these things so they don't flop around. Now for the power hookups on the compressor, you've got a black wire that runs to a ground on the frame, the red wire that comes up here to the pressure switch. Now the other side of the pressure switch we're going to take directly to the battery, but if you do it this way, make sure that you run an inline fuse. Now the last thing we need to do before we put our Ford on the ground is jack up the rear end to ride height. That way we can check the pinion angle. Now if it's off, come out here and adjust it at the heim joints on the 4-bar. Yeah, this looks good. Now I know these bags look pretty sorry right now, but as soon as we put air to them, they'll do exactly what they're supposed to. Go ahead and hit the switch, Mel.
Once you're in the weeds, it only takes about 10 to 20 seconds to pump the system back up to its highest level. But it isn't just for looks. It also gives you a much better ride and greater towing capacity.
The kit will take you about a day to install and goes for about $2,400, which is a heck of a deal for a full suspension that'll move on you. But don't move out of your seat because we've got more trucks for you after this.
If you can't stand the heat, better get out of the shop because Weld Tech is up next on Trucks. Welcome back, everybody. Of course, you've seen us use welders on the show before, and there's no doubt they can be one of the most useful tools you'll ever own. In fact, once you get over some of the fear factor that comes with using a welder, you'll wonder how you ever got by without one. And the money you can save will blow your mind as well.
There's various types of welders. There's stick, TIG, and MIG, or wire feed welders. Today we're going to focus on the MIG welder because it's the most versatile and easiest to use. And they're affordable too. This SP125 from Lincoln that we're using goes for about $500.
Now the first and most important thing when it comes to welding is safety. You have the risk of arc weld, so you have to have proper eye protection, and you'll also want to cover up any bare skin or you'll end up with an unwanted welder's tan.
Now welding is more than just filling in the gap. What you're doing is taking two pieces of metal and melting them together to make one. One of the most common questions people ask is, how do I move the gun and what should I be looking at? Ideally, you should slightly angle the gun and lead the weld bead, keeping your eye on the molten puddle behind the arc.
Looks good, man. One of the biggest gray areas with novice welders is line speed and heat, and what each of those should be. Lincoln provides a graph inside their welders that gives basic settings for both, depending upon the thickness of the steel you're welding with.
Now here's an example of some problems that you might run into. If your wire speed is too fast, you get a real erratic weld. If your wire speed is too slow, you can't retain a good bead. Now here's an example of your heat being too low. Notice how the bead is balled up on top of the metal. Look at this. No penetration out of any of those. Now, this is one that was too hot, and obviously we just blew right through it and made a big mess. Now here's what a weld should look like. This has a good even bead and good penetration.
Welding is definitely an acquired skill that takes lots and lots of practice, and these are just a few of the basic tips you'll need to get started. Remember, the more you work with it, the more you'll develop your own style, like driving or anything else. Stay right where you are. We got more trucks for you after the break. Up next on Trucks, we'll pull up a seat and take you through a little Carburetor 101 by rebuilding a classic, the Stromberg 97.
Thanks for staying with us. We know you've been wondering about this 54 Chevy, and we can't blame you because it really caught our eye too. Now this truck falls into the restification category, which means it's been restored and slightly modified, from the emerald green paint job to the original style interior.
John T. Underwood from Murfreesboro, Tennessee owns this truck, and as you can see, he spared no cost on the wood bed that's laid down on the business end of this ride. Speaking of rides, the apple and orange crate Schwinn's belong to Stacey and I, and we'll have some fun with those later on.
Under the hood is the original straight 6, but what really catches your eye is the multi-carb setup. Now there's been a huge resurgence in popularity of this type of carburation. Not only is the cool factor undeniable, but it's possible to make these things perform great and still be reliable. We're going to show you how.
Even if you're not into this type of setup, follow along because we're going to lay out the buildup of a Stromberg 97, the basics of which can be applied to a Holley, Carter, or even Quadrajet style carb. The kit we're going to use on our Stromberg here is from 97 Heaven out of Downers Grove, Illinois. It comes complete with a new accelerator pump plunger and rod, mixture screws, needle and seat, as well as all the gaskets you'll need. Best part is the entire kit only costs about $35.
First thing you do is pull off this throttle linkage. Did you take my good screwdriver?
Why wouldn't I?
Then pull the top off. Now some of the things you need to look for when buying an old Stromberg is to make sure that you've got all your linkage. You also need to check and make sure your throttle butterflies aren't rusted shut. Take out this screw, pop out the float, and then take off the needle and seat assembly. Now the problem with a lot of these older carburetors is deterioration and pitting inside the bowl. If you've got a lot of it, you better find another carburetor.
Here's a little carburetor 101 for you. This right here is your accelerator pump. Down inside the pump well is your power valve. The jets are underneath the outer plugs and your check ball is under the center one. Of course, these are your mixture screws. Now all that plus the base plate need to be removed before we can clean it.
The way the power circuit works in a carburetor is very simple. The accelerator pump comes down and gives you a spurt of gas when you first hit the throttle so you don't stall out. Then at about 3/4 throttle, it hits the plunger on the power valve, which takes over until you return to idle. The fuel is pulled by vacuum from the bowl through the metering jets, up through the emulsion tubes, and into the venturi where it's mixed with air. So all these passages need to be clear.
Once you've cleaned your housing with a good cleaner, take an air hose and blow out all the openings. After that, you can reassemble your carb. Make sure you don't over-tighten the screws or you could warp the top. Now, if you don't want to dink with this yourself, you can go to 97 Heaven and he'll custom build these beauties for you for about $200 a pop. Let's see what Stace has for us in this week's quick tip.
Now most people know that when you run steel bolts into aluminum, you need to use anti-seize or you could gall the threads and destroy them. The problem is most people don't have a tube of anti-seize in their toolbox. Well, the answer can be as close as your medicine cabinet with a little bottle of antacid. Don't laugh, I'm serious. The chalky substance coats the threads and prevents galling. It also won't burn off. And an antacid, it's a great gas treatment, medically speaking, of course. Stay with us. Truck Gear's coming up after this.
And now Truck Gear. Parts, tools, and equipment for pickups and sport utilities.
Now here's an item that should be rolling around every shop. It's the creeper seat from Summit Racing Equipment. Believe me, this will make using milk crates a thing of the past thanks to the padded seat that's much kinder to the backside. It's 13 inches high, which is perfect for doing those brake jobs or detailing the wheels on your truck. It's made of heavy gauge square tubing and has a handy tool tray to keep you from having to hunt down your tools. Trade in your milk crates for a creeper seat from Summit for about $35.
The newest entry to the traction wars is TrueTrac's gear-driven limited slip differential. Now because it's gear-driven, it won't affect your steering or wear out prematurely, problems normally associated with a clutch-type limited slip. It's also great for two-wheel drives, especially if you're pulling a boat out of the lake. Get more traction with TrueTrac for about $350.
Finally today, the front grille of a truck can leave a lasting impression. One of the hottest add-ons for late model pickups right now are grille inserts. This one's made by Stoll and runs about $100. You can pick them up for any make or model, polished or brushed. And the best part is, if you can handle a screwdriver, you can leave a lasting impression with your truck. That's going to do it for Truck Gear. Here's a preview of next week's show. We'll take the fear factor out of replacing the rocker panels and fender extensions on your early model pickup. Then it's off to the hills of Tellico, North Carolina for a battle between some extreme hybrids and even nastier rocks. Finally, we'll show you how to put the wood, grain that is, to your SUV. That's all next week on Trucks. That's going to do it for this week's show. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. Hey man, that orange one's mine.
No, you get the red one.
Stace, the chain is off for this. What'd you do to this?
I didn't touch it.
The orange one is mine.
No, the orange one's mine.
It's not going off.
Little more persuasion.
You're constantly doing this to me. Why do you constantly have to do this?
I had nothing to do with that.
Yes, you did.
Trucks is an RTM production.